time is the most precious thing that we all have. And you're sending them 16,000 hours into a system that denies the deity of Christ, that denies truth even exists, and we call that an education system. And then we're surprised when only 30% of our kids can read at grade level, and we've dropped from first in the world in education to in the middle, in the 20s or 30s, depending on what statistics you're looking at. And so it's not surprising if you look at the spheres that God created and the spheres that we've embraced. And so the first thing we need to do as Christians is rescue our own kids and then help rescue others after that.
We all know that America's cultural landscape seems to be ever shifting, and that can be a little bit unsettling. What we need now more than ever are the transcendent truths of God's Word and some dangerous friends that have our backs. So come join an incredible lineup of speakers, including Pastor Michael Foster, Rosaria Butterfield, Jamie Bambrick, the Blaze TV's own Steve Dace, and many more for Clear Truth Media's 2025 conference, Dangerous Friends. The conference is March 13th and 14th at Redemption Church in Monclova, Ohio, just outside Toledo. I'll be there as well with a podcasting booth, along with some of my friends like Greg Moore of the Dead Men Walking podcast and Parker Brown of the Watch Well podcast. I even heard that the Harbor Freight Doug Wilson himself, Keith Foskey, is also going to be in attendance. So come on by and introduce yourself. Come spend a few days in Ohio with your dangerous friends and come by my booth and say hello to claim your free civically minded gift. To purchase tickets or for more information, go to dangerousfriends25.com and be sure to enter the promo code CivEccly25 for $25 off your tickets. I hope to see you there. Well, welcome back to Civically Minded, where we give you practical theology for everyday life. I'm your host, Corey Wing. If you don't know already, all my interview segments, just like the one that you're watching now, are reproduced for my audio podcast on Apple and Spotify with a new episode every Monday. Simply search for Civically Minded and catch up on any of the interviews that you may have missed. Well, my guest today is a husband and father of 3 young children and resides in my own home state of North Carolina. He's the CEO of Classical Conversations, and under his leadership, the company has grown from supporting homeschoolers in about 40 states to supporting homeschoolers in over 50 countries and has become the world's largest classical homeschooling organization. He's on the academic board of the Classical Learning Test, as well as the Gutenberg College's board of advisors, and he's also a member of the C12 Group, the largest professional development network of Christian CEOs and executives. And he's recently launched his own podcast called Refining Rhetoric. And with all of that, I don't know how, but he still finds time to work on the spiritual fruit of patience by enjoying golf. So it is my pleasure to welcome Robert Bortons to Civically Minded. Welcome, Robert.
I'm excited to be here, Corey. And when you ask God for patience, He gives you opportunities to play that out. But I don't get to play as much golf as I would I would like to. But 3 young kids and running an organization and trying to make the Bible great again here in America. That's of course the Bible is always great, but trying to help Americans understand the biblical truth that can set them free is an important work.
Amen. I also have 3 young children. We have a 9-year-old. My son will be 6 in April, and we have a 2-year-old. So, brother, I understand chasing youngins around and doing a full-time gig, and then trying to now you've added podcasting, which of course I'm familiar with, and that's a whole nother racket. So yeah, you've got a very full plate. God bless you, brother. So tell my audience just a little bit about, I mean, obviously I did the intro read. So, I mean, a little bit about Classical Conversations is in there, but tell me a little bit about Classical Conversations, kind of how you got involved with this whole thing of Classical Conversations and what that actually is and what it means.
Yeah, so classical conversations started in my family's basement in 1997 in Winston-Salem. We had been homeschooling all our entire lives, and my mom realized that if we were going to homeschool through high school, that it would be a better, enriching experience if we did it with a group of friends who were reading the same books and studying the same things, and that we could just have a better education. And so that's really what invited her or inspired her to start it. So there was 10 students and myself in our basement that first year. Everyone wanted to do it again. So she did a second year, and there was siblings and other people that had heard about it. So she kind of gave the 16-page pages that she had written of curriculum to another mom, and just kind of went from there. In college, I went to Clemson University. My mom called me up and said that my dad had quit his job and that I had to pay for college myself, and she was going to try to make classical conversations a real business. And so I immediately said, "All right, how am I going to pay for this?" And started going to school semester, working a semester, saving money, trying to keep out of as much college debt as possible. In the meantime, classical conversations was growing, and yeah, so that's kind of the short answer for that. When I graduated college, classical conversations did not make enough money to support an income. So I had to go into the real world, and I wanted to prove to myself and to others that if you can homeschool and be successful and climb corporate ladders and things like that. And as I was doing that, classical conversations continued to grow. And I always like to say, if classical conversations didn't exist, I'd still be homeschooling my own kids, but just with a different program. But it does exist. And so I had the opportunity after about 6 years of working in the corporate world to come on board and help continue to grow classical conversations and into what it is today.
That's
And what is it? Yes,
fantastic.
I should tell people it's a once a week, homeschooling program. So it's a full K through 12. We actually have college credit and even a master's degree for parents, where, we have a curriculum and you get together once a week with a trained parent tutor. And so it's not lone schooling, it's home-centered education, and it's with a friend and, in a committed community that is all trying to do the same thing, which is to know God and to make him known. And we use the classical method in that pursuit.
So let me flesh that out a little bit just for my own mind and certainly my viewers. So say, one day a week you meet with this, more professional facilitator, who kind of helps make sure that you're on track doing all your stuff. And then the other 4 days a week are true homeschool. You're at home with your kids, kind of taking them through the material. Is that correct?
Yeah, so it's a trained, we call them a parent tutor, because they're parents in the curriculum doing the curriculum with their kid the same time you're doing with it. For kindergarten through 6th grade, the parents are actually there in class with them. The class size is typically anywhere from 6 to 12 students, and they're there learning with the kid, and we're previewing the work that you're going to be doing at home. So if you're learning about the Gulf of America, and that's not in our curriculum yet, but it will be. We got to do some updates, right?
It's on Google Maps though, so
Google Maps, right? Yeah, everyone's asking. No, just stick with the Gulf of Mexico for Memory Master this year. But yeah, so they'll preview it at home or at community, and then you'll do it at home, and they're accessible for the parent if they have any questions. And then when they start getting into middle school and high school, we want the students to take more ownership, and so the parents are welcome to come, but they can drop them off. And in that point, they're reading papers, and so they're doing the work the week beforehand, and then coming together to do mock trial or do debate or do a science experiment. And so we do a lot of public speaking practice and things like that inside these communities to build the next generation of Christian leaders.
that's fantastic. So I have a little bit of experience with alternative education. I graduated from a Christian high school of about 10. There's about 10 students in my graduating class. So the fact that your mom's first class, of classical conversations all the way back in the 90s was the same size as my graduating high school class in 1996 is pretty remarkable. So I mean that's kudos to your mom for even having that much success the first year. And then I currently am in seminary through the PCA, and what we have is called Missions to North America. It's one of the arms of the PCA, and part of the MNA or Mission in North America is what's called LAMP, which is a very similar idea in some respects. It's a self-study seminary, so for men like myself who have felt the call to ministry, but it's been a little bit different. I'm not 20 or 21, just fresh out of, school. And, we've got full-time jobs, or we've got kids and full-time jobs, or we're juggling a lot of things. This frees us up to do exactly very similar to what you're talking about, to do a lot of self-study. And then we meet with a facilitator once a week, and they're most of the facilitators are teaching elders. A few of them are ruling elders in our local presbytery, and they make sure that we're staying on course. We talk through things. I get to hear how the other men are engaging with the same material. And so I mean, for any of my viewers that are PCA, and I know I have a number of my viewers that are PCA, this is going to be very much like what we offer in this at the seminary level through LAMP. And so I mean, I can attest to the soundness of this approach. I mean, it's as long as you put the work in, and isn't this true of anything, right? As long as you put the work in, the education is certainly there. So I think that's a really neat thing. Now you say it's been growing, and obviously you left your corporate job to take this on more full time. And I think everyone knows that COVID really assisted in like the hyperbolic growth of whether it's private schools, Christian schools, certainly homeschools or homeschool co-ops of all stripes. So have you seen, certainly I would imagine you saw that same kind of hyperbolic growth during those years. Have you seen that start to taper off, or did this really ignite kind of a new long-term believer in government school alternatives?
Yeah, I think, a lot of the different things going on in COVID has made it so many parents are realizing that alternatives to government school might be more valuable than they first were realizing it. That they were maybe blindly trusting what was going on. They had a pretty good experience themselves, and they thought maybe it's the same exact experience that their kids are getting now, and they just found that it was not the case whatsoever. And so, in the homeschool community, there was roughly, the numbers vary, but estimated about 2.5 to 3 million students being homeschooled post COVID. Um, you know, through COVID, of course, there's a lot of people doing public school at home, but kind of that privately directed homeschooling number, people estimated 5 to 6 million. And so the question was, what was going to happen afterwards? As it, the schools open up, is everyone going to go back? And that just hasn't been the case. There's again, it's always hard to tell. There's not exact numbers in every single state. Like North Carolina tracks homeschoolers pretty closely. There's states like Oklahoma and stuff that don't track them at all, which is great. But they estimate now there's about 4 million homeschoolers. So roughly 50%, 70% growth pre-COVID versus post-COVID. And a lot of those people have stuck around, and yeah, it hasn't gone back. So I know private schools are growing. I know there's a lot of waiting lists and different things, at least in North Carolina, people trying to get into alternative education options. And so I even saw some research that suggests that the 30% to 50% of people will be homeschooled here in the next 10 to 20 years.
Wow.
And they really talk about almost kind of like what you're talking about with the PCA and how you guys are doing it is it's not gonna be kind of like the founding homeschoolers, the pioneers where it was kind of like you're all in, uh, but it's gonna be more of a homogeneous education system where maybe kids go to their elementary school, their local public school, and they're homeschooled for middle school, and then they go to the Catholic school for junior high and back to the public school for their, junior and senior year. So I think there's gonna be a lot more movement. I think I saw some research that suggests 1 out of 8 kids, who graduate in the next, like, 4 years will have been homeschooled, uh, parent directed, at least, for 1 year. So it's very much, where I was a lot of people, even in our church, I might have been the only homeschooler they knew, to now, people work with homeschoolers, they know a family that's homeschooling that's maybe doing it for reasons that aren't religious. Just the amount of material and support out there has grown tremendously from when I started, and there was maybe 3 or 4 different curriculum to providers, and now there's hundreds out there. And then you said there's local micro schools that might be 2-day a week homeschool co-ops, or 3-day a week university model schools, or 5-day a week private schools. So there's all sorts of options out there now for parents, and they're trying to figure out how to get little Johnny to read, since I think only about 30% of students can read at grade level now.
Mm. Yeah, it's incredible to me that we have fallen off, and that's we'll get to that in just a minute. That's something I definitely want to talk about, especially with what's going on kind of in the government and some of the things being said by our current administration and through Doge and some of that. But we'll get to that. So As one of these quote alternatives, however, and I am not going to pretend to be an expert on the topic. My older brother is a public school teacher in the state of Tennessee, um, and he has been an SBC pastor for over 20 years as well. So he's kind of had he's not your average public school educator. He's also taught in college, and he's done some. He's been all over the board, but he's got a lot of experience. And he would be the first one to say, "Man, there's major problems." Major problems. But in my experience, many of the public school teachers, especially, do not have that kind of self awareness. It's they have these incredible blinders on that are like, I'm a superhero and we're doing a great job, and we're going. Do you look at test scores? I mean, do you? I mean, like what the statistic you just shared. I mean, most of our kids can't read. They can't do math. I mean, what do you mean you're a superhero? You're not. That we're not doing a great job. So, but when we talk about alternatives. Share with our viewers a little bit, and honestly, with me a little bit about that, because this is such a buzzword in my world, and I hear it a lot at church, and just from a lot of even Christian parents that think it's this giant, silver bullet of salvation. Uh, what can you tell us about the fancy term charter school? Is a charter school just a fancy government school? Is it something different? Can you explain that for our folks?
Yeah, so, painting with broad brushes because charter schools, can be managed a little bit differently depending on each state, but in general, what a charter school means is it's been chartered by the state or county, to operate, and so it's fully funded by the government, and it can be managed, by a separate entity, and so they don't necessarily have to comply with every single state regulation, but they have to comply with the whatever the charter schools in that state have to comply with. Typically, one of those is, it has to be morally neutral. It can't be like, oh, this is, a Christian charter school or Muslim charter school or an atheist charter school. They can't push a particular worldview on them. Although I think Oklahoma is trying to open a Catholic charter school to see if that passes legal mustered. But ultimately, it's government financing for education outside of it, and so there's some that do it really well. There's some that don't do it really well. There's all sorts of different things around it, but in general, the results of charter schools you know have not wildly outperformed your local public school as far as outcomes are concerned. And a lot of this, and I think what the root problem is in our American education system is all of the systems try to tell you by design that parents don't matter. And so, because one, parents aren't having to pay for it, and we all know if you're a free market economic that you pay for things that matter to you. So that's one thing that's just going to be inherently wrong in a redistribution education system where you're taking money for your neighbors to pay for your education. Charter schools, there's obviously some effort that has to be put in by the parents to make that decision to go to a charter school, to apply for that, to make sure that the kids have transportation to get to the charter school. So, just right there, you see a little bit more of parental involvement in the kids' education, but the parents still aren't, funding it from their own work, and it's being funded through the government. And so, you still so you can get slightly better outcomes just because the parents are slightly more engaged, but the inherent problem, in my belief is the Bible gives, there's no Bible verses that I've found, and I continually to challenge someone that can find one that gives civil government any responsibility over education. And so if God did not design the world around civil government having that responsibility, it's no surprise that we spend $18,000 a year per student on average in the United States, and only 30% of our kids can read because it's inherent to the system.
Yeah, you're kind of getting into something that's near and dear to my heart. I've taught on this at my church. I've taught on this on this channel. The kind of the idea of sphere sovereignty. That God has uh, set the world up in such a way that different authoritative powers. In the home, of course, it would be the father, the husband, have been given supernaturally by the Lord divine authority over that sphere. And if children are the responsibility of the parent, whether that's their education or their spiritual, upbringing through the fear and the admonition of the Lord, as it says in Scripture, that. And we have ceded that to Caesar or to the government, at least for I'm 47 or soon to be 47, at least for the last 50 plus years. And really, it goes back considerably further than that. And then we're very surprised when our kids come out of a lengthy stay in the government schools not resembling anything of the child that we sent in back in, kindergarten or first grade. And we scratch our heads and go, well, they were such a good kid, back at third grade or fourth grade, whatever your terminus that in your mind. I've noticed as so many parents kind of get their kids locked in their heads at a certain age, and it's hard for you to see them beyond whatever age that is, and that can differ per parent, of course. But and so I know from being in a pastoral role at a church and having done that even, years ago as a youth pastor back in my late 20s and things, how many Christian parents would come to us and say, "Oh, Johnny or Susie are just, they've abandoned the Lord, they've abandoned the church." And you want to say all the right things and all the comforting things, but what you've seen is you've seen this coming. Anyone with two eyes that was on the outside looking in kind of went, duh. I mean, do you know Susie? Do you know Johnny? I mean, everyone else isn't surprised by this. We kind of saw the trajectory where it was headed, and the parents sadly are so many times the last to know. And so I love that these alternatives are growing, and that there's more and more options out there for parents. And especially again, as someone in a pastoral role, what I also love is then that gives us who have leadership in yet a different sphere, in that ecclesiastical sphere, to then say to our people, look, you have fewer excuses than you've ever had. Fine, you both work. Okay. But if you're not spending because I think that price tag is such a big one for so many people, is they see public school as free, though you and I would both say, oh, it's not.
Cost your child soul, that's pretty expensive in
Well,
many
and
cases.
and the tax dollars alone, and again, I think we're both savvy enough to know if I wasn't spending it on educational purposes, let's be honest, the state's still going to take it, the federal government's still going to take our taxes for something. So I get where they're coming at from that, but even just from a financial standpoint, homeschooling and so many Christian education models even these days are so much less than they were even 10, 15, 20 years ago. When Christian education was much more expensive, the resources, as you said earlier, have gotten to be so much more available that it's just is it been your experience that it's more affordable now than ever?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the options are out there and the affordability is definitely, I haven't done the research to do it, but I would suspect that Christian education on par, is more accessible. Like our church has a Christian education fund. So if a parent, can't afford a Christian education, they can come and help get, subsidized that way through the church, which is responsible for doing those type of things, not the civil government. Our church sponsors some local private schools. So there's a private school that was birthed out of our church, and we provide them funding. We have a 3-day a week university model school at our church. Once a week, they have a classical conversations group come to our church. We have the other day, I know that sometimes different homeschool co-ops use it. So, our church has made, I think, a great example of making the church the center of education. And, as a pastor, I mean, what's your main role is to educate
Yeah.
and lead your people. And what's the main purpose of education? It's to know God and to make him known. And, homeschoolers at least get 16,000 hours back with their kids that they didn't get that, would be going to this state. And there is civil government in charge of education, I think twice in the Old Testament. It was both times when Israel was attacked and brought into other countries. The story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the story of Daniel, right? The foreign governments knew if they were going to bring these Israelites into their country, they had to get them educated through their government school systems. And so that's really the only time that we see education going and being belong to the state is when it's to indoctrinate followers of Christ into different belief systems. And that's what our government schools do. If Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life, and government schools teach that there's no such thing as truth, that it's my truth and your truth. I mean, you're sending your kids. Time is the most precious thing that we all have. And you're sending them 16,000 hours into a system that denies the deity of Christ, that denies truth even exists. And we call that an education system. And then we're surprised when, only 30% of our kids can read at grade level. And we've dropped from first in the world in education to in the middle, in the 20s or 30s, depending on what statistics you're looking at. And so it's not surprising if you look at the spheres that God created and the spheres that we've embraced. And so the first thing we need to do as Christians is rescue our own kids and then help rescue others after that.
Yeah. Yeah. Kind of that model that we see in the Sermon on the Mount, even about don't, everyone loves to misquote the "don't judge anybody" verse, and I always say, no, 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 that's not what it says. It says if you're going to judge and when you judge, because the assumption is that Paul tells the Corinthians, we indeed will judge even angels. It's remove the plank from your own eye so that you can see the speck in your fellow man's eye, and that's very similar to that advice you just gave. You make sure that our kids and that our church members are well educated, and then we can go into the community and kind of help them. So speaking of these again different alternatives and the government always helping in whatever way they think they are, at least. Another big topic, because my channel follows a lot of political engagement and things too. So another big topic that we've seen in the news, and we've seen not just in this new administration, it's actually been on the horizon now for quite some time, are different states introducing these ESAs, or education savings accounts. I was in an X space just a few weeks ago when Tennessee was leading up to doing the vote that they have just recently done, correct, on an ESA there in Tennessee. And you and a number of other educators were in that X space, and I just kind of sat in the background and listened and tried to soak up as much as I could. And you guys, again, all of you did a wonderful job of kind of walking us that were in there listening through that. Tell my audience a little bit about kind of what an ESA is and what it's not, because I think a lot of well-intentioned Christian parents hear this kind of language, and
Mhm.
and they hear especially their Republican, representatives or their senators talk about it, and they're like, well, golly, that sounds awfully swell, and what and I'm coming to understand is it is not as advertised, correct?
Yeah, so the school choice is got a great marketing plan and terrible legislation behind it. And so yeah, I wish it was the answer, but it's not. I have a whole podcast series on my Refining Rhetoric podcast that delves into the details more than we'll have, 5 hours worth of details versus the few minutes we have here today. Uh, but but they claim, a couple of the claims is it's letting you spend your tax dollars where you want. And the thing is, not a single bill has actually done that. It's all redistributed your neighbor's tax dollars into your pocket. And as I mentioned earlier, that's not a realm, a sphere of that the civil government has responsibility for. Uh, and they say it's with no strings attached, but every single one has strings attached. And so to be eligible for this money, you have to be accredited. And who accredits you? Well, the state accredits you. Well, what else does the state accredit? Well, the state accredits the public schools. And so if they're going to, say, hey, you have to take this money, they don't put many strings on in the initial bill, but anybody who studied even an ounce of history knows that's how these bills get started. I mean, just look at Obamacare, right? At the beginning, it was all fully subsidized by the federal government, and we went, billions and trillions of dollars in debt, and everything was going to be great. And now we're here, just a decade later, and healthcare costs are through the roof, medical debts through the roof, and there's all sorts of strings. Like, obviously Trump's done some great things, but one of the things that happened in COVID was right? The jab. And you had to get a COVID shot if you wanted to work in a hospital. Well, that was because the government was paying the bills. And so you can imagine if the school choice had passed during COVID, all these Republican legislators who closed down the public schools would have also closed down the private schools, right? All these Republican legislators who were, turning a blind eye to these jab mandates or stuff would have turned their eye at the private schools as well. And so ultimately, what school choice does is it creates a dependency on the state. It expands the welfare state to people who are currently affording their bills, and basically capturing these institutions under state control. Now, your typical Republican legislator has no idea this is what they're doing. They see a problem. Little Johnny can't read. The public schools, which again, let's point out, they have full control over. They could create rules and accountability measures to make sure Johnny can read. Um, they are now taking that monetary monstrosity and trying to put it on the private school. So the hard part is, they are most of these people are doing it out of the goodness of their heart, but the ideas originated in leftist, teachers union schools at Cal Berkeley in the '70s. It migrated to the United Nations, and they have an education arm called UNESCO, that is actually running the school choice playbook already in Europe. The European countries have lost basically all private education. At first, there's no strings attached, and then they say, "Well, you got to teach this and you got to teach that, and now you have to have DEI and ESG, and you can't discriminate against LGBT, or whatever new acronym that's coming up with. You have to teach global warming. You got to have equity and inclusion." And eventually, your Christian private school that's being funded by the government looks no different than the atheist public school down the road, because they have to teach the exact same thing or they lose their accreditation. And of course, they're gonna teach it because they don't wanna lose the job. They have mortgages to pay, and yeah, they don't teach it to the same extreme level as the, purple-haired teacher, in the public managed school down the road, but they still teach it, which again, there's a saying in marketing that the medium is the message, that how you deliver a message is what they're gonna say. So if you teach free market economics, but you're doing it from a captured or Marxist redistribution of wealth scheme, people are actually going to say, okay, I don't really believe free market economics because you didn't believe it because that's not how you paid your bills. You paid it through a redistribution scheme.
Yeah.
And it should be no surprise that 90% of college professors are leftists because they don't have to live in the free market. They don't work in the free market. They don't compete in the free market. They have government subsidized tuition that pays their bills, and so they can be free to be socialists. And that's the same thing that's going to happen. There's not. It's going to take 10 to 15 years. It took 19 years in Sweden for them to outlaw homeschooling, because government was paying for your education. There's no need to homeschool,
Mhm.
but it won't take very long. Within 1 or 2 generations, educational choice will be gone, and the only choice you'll have is which government approved institution to send your kids to.
So as citizens, if we're afraid of that, and I mean, just hearing you say that is terrifying to me. How do we push back on a system that, well intended or not, is really, at the end of the day, a power grab for the hearts and minds of our children? And what do we do? What as Christian parents, as Christian, say, grandparents, or maybe even just a young person that watches my channel that isn't a parent yet, but one day wants to get married and have kids. How do we push back in a country where we still have free elections to say, look, this is not what we want 10 years from now, 50 years from now. We want choice for our children, true choice, not choice that's attached to a government, purse.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I think the first thing to do is, familiarize yourself, start contacting your legislators, letting them know, getting involved in your local, parties and elections. I think that that's huge. Like part of the reason that our, government has gone so sideways is Christians have remained silent. We've remained silent, that the pulpits remain silent, and we've watched the world around us crumble. And somewhere between 2 and 4% of Gen Z have a biblical worldview when we had it well into the double digits just 10 or 20 years ago. And so what we've been doing isn't working. So I mean, I think it's a couple things. We have this consumer mentality that we have. We're all on this hamster wheel. A lot of us haven't done the math. Kids are out of school about 100 days per year, and if you think it costs about $300 a day to have someone else watch your kid in those situations, so you might be spending $30,000 a year on daycare services because you have to work full time. Well, guess what? You could probably stay at home, cook more meals at home, lower a little bit of your cost of living, and educate your kids and actually bring home more money at the end of the day. So there's some of that. You know, a lot of people get married and they don't have any kids right away. And so they get used to a lifestyle and they don't think about, hey, I need to pay for Christian school one day for my kids. And so they get into this debt cycle, which is not good, right? The Bible is very clear on that. And so that they have to work two jobs because of the lifestyle choices they've made, and so they have to be willing to give up those, they have to sacrifice. One of the reasons in America, I believe, that our next generation isn't going to be as well off as ours is because we've had a generation that has refused to make sacrifices for the next generation. And that's a big issue in our country. I mentioned earlier what our church does. Every single pastor listening to this needs to start a Christian education fund at their church. You can do it tomorrow. Maybe it only helps one or two kids that first year, but God forbid. The Bible's pretty clear on what happens to people who lead kids astray, and I don't see how allowing people to send their kids to public school and not figuring out how to rescue them is going to be a good conversation when we get to the Bema seat. And I have plenty of things that I'm ashamed of that I'm going to have very tough conversations on the Bema seat. But allowing children to, uh, you know, be in Marxist institutions is not one of them. And so we have got to stop being afraid of the public school teachers or the principals in our congregation. I mean, my wife was a public school teacher for 10 years. She did her best with those kids, but she saw 300 kids per day. It's
Mm.
just statistically impossible to love 300 kids per day. We cannot, hey parents, if you have no other choice but to have your kids in public school right now, you've got to have a plan to get them out. Maybe it's a 3-year plan, maybe it's a 5-year plan. What can you do at nights? What can you do on the weekends to make sure that you are engaged in their education? Making sure that they know how to read. Like we've outsourced so much of our kids' lives to civil government that we don't know these simple things that our parents and grandparents knew because it wasn't given to us. So it's not easy. It's going to require sacrifices. And so we need a vision of Christians paying for Christian education. I think, I don't know the exact number, but there's like $17 trillion worth of wealth that's going to get passed on to the next generation over the next 10 years. Don't wait. If your grandchildren are not in a Christian school, pay for their tell your grandkids that they're gonna go to Christian school and you're gonna pay for it.
Yeah.
What a blessing. What an eternal blessing that you can give your grandkids today. And, grandparents get involved in your kids' lives because it's a generational issue because just like these generations of poverty that we've seen in different communities because they get addicted to welfare and that's all they know, and the parents aren't involved, they're not married. That has crept into the church where we have started not having generational households. We don't generationally think, but the Bible is very clear about generations and the importance of it and how God looks at the different generations. So we've got to get back to a biblical worldview, and that means making sacrifices and getting off the materialistic hamster wheel that so many of us find ourselves on.
It's incredible advice. You beat me to it. I was going to definitely mention grandparents and other extended family members. I mean, if yeah, and I'm thinking directly about a lady in our church who's never married. She doesn't have kids of her own. She talks about her nieces and nephews as if they are her kids. So for any of you watching that again, maybe for whatever reason, through just the Lord's providence, or maybe even some of your own choices, you don't have kids of your own, look in your church. Look for Christian children, who maybe their parents, one of them have a decision to make, but for whatever reason they just, right now they can't afford it, or whatever the reasons are. Try to find ways to, whether it's volunteer your time, offer a little bit more, and just offering at the church. Again, go to your elders or your deacons at your church, your leadership, and say, "Hey, are we doing this? Can we do this?" I mean, there are certainly ways that we can be more involved as a community of believers to help raise up our children. Because I know, like in the PCA, where I'm, on staff, when a young person certainly joins the church, as a full, what we call a full communicant member, meaning they've had a profession of faith, the whole 9 yards. We make certain commitments to every member that, they're gonna make commitments to us as a church, and we're gonna make commitments to them as a member. But even when parents bring their child for baptism, which can be, I mean, newborn, or say they're coming to our church from another church or what have you. It can be any type of young person, right? Because again, we're Paedo Baptist. um Again, there are promises that we make to those parents and to those children. And so we need to make good on the covenantal promises that we've made, not only to the Lord, certainly to the Lord, but even to one another as brothers and sisters in Christ. And I think that's incredibly important. Well, with the last 10 minutes or so that we have, because I know we're coming up on a hard time limit here. The last topic I want to kind of spend the next and final 10 minutes on is, uh, again, in the political realm. President Trump and this new administration have been making all kinds of waves. We're coming up on their first month, and everyone, is like, "Holy smokes, this guy! How has he done all this?" It's not even been a month. I mean, just the work rate that they have been able to accomplish in the first month has just been incredible, and he's gotten all these very, um, high value, hardworking people that he surrounded himself with this time. And man, can you see the results? But President Trump and even people like Elon Musk have been hinting at the possibility of ending the federal Department of Education. And of course, there are tons of feelings on this. Some people that are like, yeah, yeah, let's do it right now. Others that are just, my older brother's a teacher, and he said, half the faculty at his school is like, they're freaking out. I mean, they're losing their minds, thinking, "What's going to happen?" Blah blah blah. But, well, and I want to give this as a little bit of a lead in, and then I'm going to give you kind of the rest of the time that we have. But most people don't know. And I just had, the attorney, uh, Davis Yance on yesterday. I think Davis, and he was talking about birthright citizenship. And again, one of the things he told me and my audience yesterday was that didn't start until after the Civil War. Everyone thinks birthright citizenship goes all the way back to our Constitution. It doesn't actually.
Right.
And I think because some of these, uh, cabinet departments they're older, and they're older than most of the people that watch my channel even, they assume that they've been around forever. But the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare was created on April 11th, 1953 by then President Dwight D. Eisenhower, which isn't that long ago. My dad, who has went on to be with the Lord, was born in 1952. So I mean, that's not that long ago. And then in October of 1979, President Jimmy Carter would sign the Department of Education Organization Act into law, which would actually take that original cabinet level department and break it into two departments, which we would now know as the Department of Education and the Department of Health and Human Services. Kind of that one big department kind of got, broken into these two departments that we now have. And that would happen, and those would become official entities on May 4th of 1980. That's not that long ago. So the Department of Education in the way that we know it, has only existed since May of 1980. I mean, that's not that long ago. And so when we look at that as an institution or some kind of an instantiated, repository of just power, can it be toppled? Is this something that, in you run a lot of educational circles? Do you think there's actually the political will to see the federal Department of Education toppled?
I think this is the best opportunity that, we've ever had, and so, yeah, it's only been around for, less than 50 years as its own department. During those 50 years, as I mentioned earlier, we've gone from the first in the world in education to just, well below average. So, I mean, I think a couple things. Linda McMahon, I know the person that's helping her get confirmed. It's very clear from President Donald Trump that her goal is to close down the Department of Education. Uh, that cannot be done without Congress passing a law to do that. That is a much bigger lift. And so, if you're listening to this, contact your, nicely say, contact your congressman, contact your senator. We need to shut down the Department of Education. Now, that is step one. If you, there's still things like Every Child Succeeds Act and Common Core and all of these
No,
federal
no
education
child left
laws.
behind,
No
all that
Child
stuff,
Left
yep.
Behind. These are all globalist United Nations, just like school choice. These are all out of the United Nations ideas of education being centralized in the federal government. So it does no good to end the Department of Education and keep all of these federal education laws on the books. So there's not enough people talking about that, and so hopefully we can get it out altogether. Uh, when public school was first started in the United States, it was very local. It was your local town, it was your local county, it was county taxes, it was parents paying for it out of their pockets. They're hosted by a church that was, paying for the building itself. And then the people were told, well, if the state manages it, we can do it for less expensive, and they can put these resources into researching these things to make sure everyone's getting a great education. And what happened was they centralized the education. Education got more expensive, and the results became worse. And of course, as Christians, we know because it went farther from the sphere of influence that God designed it to be under. Well,
Mhm.
then they did the same thing with the federal government, and a lot of it had to do just like with birthright citizenship, with civil rights laws, and making sure that all of Americans were being treated equally and had the same opportunities. And so that was again the good-hearted nature behind it. But what we see is when the sphere of influence gets farther and farther away from the people that God gave it to, the worse and worse the results become, and
Yeah.
society suffers as a whole, and the children suffer as a whole. And so a big reason that educators are nervous about it is, one, the federal government mandates certain things, and to pay for it, they collect taxes and then distributes it to the states. And that's also how they force states to, let boys participate in girls' sports. When there's a Democrat in office, or if there's a Republican office, the Republicans force them not to allow boys in girls' sports. So it's just this constant football, kind of political football being used. And so the federal government's got to get out of education altogether. It's got to get, the student loan crisis was caused by making all student loans belong basically to the federal government. And they use the power of the purse strings to force ideological worldviews on our students that are, they don't care about getting them to learn to read. They want them to make sure that they embrace these, three-letter ideologies, or, climate change, or, whatever the latest globalist buzzwords are. And
Yeah.
so, yes, we got to get rid of the Department of Education. But after that, there's 50 states, and each of those have a Department of Education that we got to get rid of. And some of those are in their constitution to do these things. And so you got to get state constitutions changed. So just like the abortion movement, had one law that they're after. Now we've got 50 states that we need to reform, and hearts and minds to change. Just like the Bible says about education, that the father's hearts have to, be on the children to have cultural change. And a lot of fathers don't know what that looks like. And so, yeah, I think from the political will to end the Department of Education, I guess once these budgets are released out of Congress, we'll see if they're funding these things. And then president, one of the reasons that there's been this flurry of activity is the last 4 years, some of the conservatives' biggest and brightest minds have been putting together these executive orders, creating the legal framework to get them through the lawsuits that will inevitably happen. And so this wasn't by chance. And so I think, when I talk to leaders in Congress, they know, or at least the ones I talk to, that they need to end the Department of Education. But we'll see what happens when the teachers unions and lobbies, because I mean each state's different, but you're looking at 25 to 35% of some states' education budgets coming from the federal government.
Yeah.
And so uh, if that money gets taken away, well, we need that portion of our taxes returned to the taxpayer. So we need to have a tax reduction so the federal government isn't collecting it and the American people can keep it. And then states, if they want to have those same laws and same funding levels, they can tax their citizens. They can pass those laws on the state level if they want. I would, encourage them not to do either of those things. But it's not like they don't have the power to do it, but it gives, maybe the state of California wants to do those things, and so now state taxes in California are 20% of your income, but here in North Carolina, they're 2%, and I don't think you guys have a state income tax in Tennessee, so, they're gonna collect their taxes some other way,
Yeah.
and so we need to, get out of the welfare system for everyone. If we want a social safety net, it should be temporary. And we start that by creating our own infrastructure and our own programs. And it starts with our local churches and our local leaders giving that vision of a Christian education paid for by Christians, and let Caesar do Caesar things.
Well, what was interesting to me is in this kind of final thought is that original organization that birthed the Department of Education as we know it was called the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. So what you just said is that this is all wrapped into kind of the big uh, leviathan that has become the welfare state. Well, it literally is. I mean, you trace this back. It literally is all built into that welfare state. So well, Robert, thank you for your time and your expertise today. Thank you for what you do for Christian education and for parents and for the church to get more robustly involved in the education of our own children. I can't say how grateful I am, as a fellow North Carolinian for you being such a wonderful representation of us as just Christians, but also us as Tar Heels. And certainly know that we are in prayer for you and your organization. And if ever we can be a blessing to you guys, you've got a friend here in Civically Minded.
Well, Corey, thanks for so much for being on the show today, and I've gotten to know you more through X and different things. So look forward to meeting you in person one day, or and spending eternity with you in heaven. I mean, Christians just need to remember that we are on this awesome journey and that we will be with each other forever. And so just let's connect, let's build here. Let's not wait till let God, let God know Christianity is an action-oriented faith.
That's
Go
right.
tell, go build. That's what we need to be doing as Christians. So would love if you're listening, go give me a follow on X, the Robert B Show. If you want to hear about a biblical worldview, I have wonderful speakers on my podcast, Refining Rhetoric, and definitely go check out classicalconversations.com if you want to know more about giving your child or grandchildren a classical Christian education. So thank you so much for having me on the show today.
God bless, brother. Take care.